When animal attacks make the headlines, usually fatal injuries are caused by some of the deadliest predators on the planet. But sometimes, the most innocent-looking of animals can cause the most harm. These are three of the most bizarre and unusual fatal animal attacks on humans you'll ever hear. This is Ultimate Misfortune. In late October 2019, 66-year-old Thomas Alexander was on the hunt. He had waited for the muzzleloader season to start in Arkansas. This allowed hunters to use older, more traditional firearms. It was perhaps a more challenging form of hunting, but it was so much more rewarding. Thomas set off to Yellville. He set up in a deer stand and waited. The sounds of nature surrounded him as he scoured the surroundings for any sign of deer. His patience was rewarded when he spotted a deer emerging into a clearing. It was a buck, a magnificent sight with impressive antlers and glistening fur. Thomas's heart was pounding in his chest. He raised his rifle and peered down the sight, steadying his breathing. The deer was a fair distance away, and Thomas held his nerve, waiting for the opportune moment to fire. As the deer stepped closer, its head bowed down, grazing the grasses. It was unaware of the danger standing just yards away. When the deer raised its head, Thomas squeezed the trigger. A loud crack rang out and the deer fell to the ground. Thomas lifted his head. It looked like a clean shot. He looked through his binoculars. The deer didn't move a muscle. Thomas climbed down from the deer stand and rested his gun against it while he went to check on the buck. He was chuffed that he had secured a fine-looking specimen. He kept his eyes on the animal as he approached, but the deer wasn't dead. It heard Thomas's footsteps approaching from behind, and it suddenly clambered to its feet. Thomas jumped back and was now only a few feet away from the animal. He was face to face with the enormous and enraged buck. Immediately, it charged at Thomas. He was so close to it that he didn't have time to dive out of the way. The buck drove its antlers into the hunter, and he gasped as they pierced his ribcage. He fell to the ground, and the deer gored him before leaping off and running away. Thomas was left gravely injured. He fumbled about for his mobile phone, which was in his pocket. Clasping his chest, he dialed his wife's number, and she picked up. He managed to relay what had happened, and she immediately called the emergency services. Thomas's nephew was the nearest family member to his location and rushed to the scene, arriving just before the emergency services did. Thomas was fading fast. His heart was giving out. When the paramedics arrived, they requested an air ambulance, but Thomas stopped breathing and his heart stopped beating. They began CPR and instead drove him to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The hunting trip had turned into a tragedy. The deer was never found and clearly lived to graze another day. But what had happened? Nobody knows exactly. Hunters are cautioned to wait at least 30 minutes after shooting a deer before walking over to it. You would think that a seasoned hunter like Thomas would have waited, but his anticipation and excitement caused him to act too soon. Keith Stephen, from the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, said that it was one of the strangest things that had happened in his 20-year career. Weighing up to 280 pounds, it is easy to see how a wounded mule deer could cause the tragic death of a human being. The next animal is a much smaller and considered one of the most unlikely species to kill a man. Once nearly hunted to extinction in Europe for their fur and scent glands, in recent years, beavers have made a comeback. They have been reintroduced to some parts, and with the right management and a ban on hunting them, they are now thriving. In May 2013, a fisherman, who has not been named at the request of his family, headed to Chestyakovsko Lake, situated west of the Belarusian capital Minsk. He and a group of friends were planning on a fishing trip, but they never made it. At the side of the road, they spotted a beaver. The cute and cuddly-looking animal was ambling about in the long grass not far from the water's edge. When the friends stopped the car, it was the perfect photo opportunity. How many people can say that they've had a selfie with a beaver? Over the past decade, the beaver population in Belarus has rocketed to 880,000. They are now considered a nuisance as they are destroying forests and farms. There are so many that conflicts with humans are becoming increasingly common, and reports of aggressive beavers entering people's properties are growing. The fisherman and his friends climbed out of their car and crossed over to the other side of the road. The beaver saw them but didn't run away. The beavers in Belarus had become bold. It continued to snuffle among the grass, and the fisherman saw his opportunity. He pulled his mobile phone from his pocket and strode over to the beaver. When he was just feet away, he stepped slowly closer before lunging at it and grabbing it by the scruff of the neck. With some beavers weighing up to 66 pounds, the fisherman was taken by surprise by the creature's weight. The power of the animal was immense. It thrashed around and bit him repeatedly. In a panic, the man dropped the beaver and it ran away, seeking refuge back in the water. However, it had left a devastating and deadly mark. Renowned for chopping down trees with their incredibly powerful jaws and long, sharp teeth, the beaver had severed the man's artery in his leg. Blood erupted out of his leg, and his friends rushed to his aid. They applied pressure to the wound, trying to stem the bleeding, but the blood kept coming. They knew time was against them. They piled him into the back of the car and rushed to the village of Ostroshitsky Gorodok and into the medical clinic, but on the way, he died from blood loss. He was the first person to have died from a beaver attack in Belarus. Typically, nocturnal animals and beavers can become disoriented when out and about during the day. They are then more likely to attack out of fear. To reduce their numbers to more manageable levels, the forestry minister has considered bringing back beaver hunting, but it is unlikely to be a popular sport as the animals are very easy targets near dams. The goonch, otherwise known as the giant devil catfish, is a very large species of catfish. It is native to India and has caused quite a stir owing to its immense size. Some grow as long as an adult human and weigh more than 220 pounds. Between 1998 and 2007, the villages along the Kali River were plagued by mysterious disappearances. In April of 1998, a group of friends were bathing in the murky waters of the river. As they splashed about just feet from the muddy bank, something approached them from the depths. It had a taste for human flesh. The burnt remains of people discarded from funeral pyres along the river had been washed into the water. The predator, typically a piscivore, had grown to an exceptional size. It was larger than any specimen ever recorded before. With one gulp from its enormous mouth, it sucked up one of the boys, 17-year-old Dil Bahadur, underwater right before his friends. He managed to let out half a cry before he disappeared. His friends leaped out of the water and immediately alerted the village. A search ensued, but despite 3 days of scouring the river and its banks, no trace of the boy was ever found. It was a mystery as to what had taken Dil. His friends hadn't seen the knobbly back of the crocodile or the dorsal fin of a bull shark. The currents in the river were non-existent in that stretch. Something out of the ordinary had taken him that afternoon, but nobody knew what. The river was considered relatively safe for locals to swim and bathe in, but just 3 months later, the mysterious creature struck again. This time it took place at Drampur. A man and his young son were bathing in the water. Their splashes were detected by the covert predator, and it moved in for the kill silently and rapidly. The young boy was pulled under the water just feet from his horrified father. The man scrambled about in the river, trying desperately to grab a hold of his son, but the brown water made it impossible to see. Yet another frantic search ensued, but no remains of the boy were ever found. People became cautious about entering the river. What had once been a safe and enjoyable activity was now something that could cost them their lives. But as the months and years passed, people began to feel safe again in the Kali River. While the families of those who disappeared would never forget, others did until the creature struck again. This time, in 2007, an 18-year-old Nepali man was enjoying the river amongst friends when he suddenly felt something grab him around the waist. In an instant, he was pulled below the surface of the water and disappeared without a trace. When word spread about the mysterious river monster, British biologist Jeremy Wade offered to investigate. He was determined to catch whatever was responsible for the attacks. No one had seen anything other than a flash of gray when one of the victims was dragged down. It wasn't much to go on, but what Jeremy did was consider all the things it could possibly be. He examined the stretch of river where the attacks had taken place. It was only a 4-mile length of river. At first, he thought the most likely explanation was a whirlpool or unexpected water currents. For the victims to be dragged underwater almost silently, without a ferocious amount of splashing, as is often the case with a shark attack, water currents seemed to be the logical explanation. But that stretch of river had no turbulence in it. Intrigued by the mystery, Jeremy began listening to the villagers. A domestic water buffalo weighing 350 pounds was dragged into the water while it was drinking in the shallows during his inspection. Jeremy listened to the people and considered the goonch as a possibility. Jeremy calculated that the catfish would need to weigh 300 pounds for a predator to take hold of an animal that size. It dawned on him that he was hunting a monster. Since saltwater crocodiles never ventured so far upriver, they were written off. The water was too chilly for mugger crocodiles, and gharials lacked the jaws to swallow a fully grown man. Nor had any of the villagers ever seen crocodiles enjoying the sun on the banks. Because the assaults occurred in shallow water, bull sharks were also ruled out because the sharks were so far upriver and no one had ever seen a dorsal fin break the surface. Perhaps the villagers had it right. Perhaps it was the gigantic devil catfish. Jeremy baited one of the catfish by setting up a funeral pyre. True enough, the next day, they saw the capture of a goonch that set a record. It weighed 160 pounds and stood 6 feet 7 inches. It was big enough to fit a little child, for sure, but the goonch would have to be considerably bigger to fit a fully grown man and a water buffalo. Although the incidents are still unresolved, most people, including Jeremy, thought that the goonch was to blame for the fatal attacks. We hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, share the channel, and click the bell to get notifications. Tell us about your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching Ultimate Misfortune.